My name's Tom Allen. I'm part of the leadership team for the Atlanta chapter of the FANG. I always like to thank our sponsors who are Benchmark Consulting Real Estate Services, RSM, and FranNet. And others with me on the leadership team not present tonight are John Noyd, Sean O'Shea, Mike Stolarina, Will Roselle, and Gary Battles. Also want to thank Joyce Gibney from the corporate office, who's going to help out with, who always helps out with getting the calls arranged and the speakers arranged. And tonight's going to work a couple of the poll questions. So without further ado, let me introduce someone who's a neighbor to us from the Atlanta chapter, Jay Weiser, who lives in Alpharetta. Jay's the principal and founder of Jay Weiser Consulting. He's dedicated to enabling leaders and organizations to not only survive, but thrive in the face of disruptiveness and uncertainty. Through speaking, training, and advisory services, he helps his clients succeed by improving their preparedness and readiness. This enables them to better withstand disruptions, recover quickly, accelerate growth, and be positioned to jump on opportunities faster. Jay has over 3 decades of experience advising executives across multiple industries and in various environments. His clients and employers span the middle market from Forbes 500, including recognizable names like Auto Trader, Bristol Myers Squibb, Fulton County Schools, JP Morgan Chase, Publix. He frequently shares his thought leadership on his site, www.jweiser.com, and on LinkedIn. He has an undergrad degree from the Wharton School and an MBA from Emory. And like I said, lives in Alpharetta with his wife. And tonight he's going to talk about the 5 leadership superpowers and how we can address those as leaders. So without further ado, thank you, Jay, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Let's just, we're going to share screens here. Just bear with me for 1 second. There we go. Okay.
So Jay, before you start, let me just say we're going to put, if people have questions, you can put them in the chat, and then Jay will pause later on in the presentation and we'll sort of read from the chat. If you've seen that already in the chat, I apologize because I didn't have the chat up while I was talking.
And, then we'll also have some time for discussion and questions at the end. So to start off, in today's session, you're going to learn why new leadership capabilities are really needed to compete in a disruptive, uncertain world. I think, we've all found over the last couple of years that, what we knew, how we did things is not necessarily the best way to do things going forward. When you're faced with disruption, uncertainty, COVID, supply chain issues, inflation, you name it, it's happening all around us, and we have to change our thinking. So we're going to talk about what the 5 leadership superpowers are, why they're important, what kind of capabilities they give your organization, and what kind of outcomes you can expect from having the capabilities. And we're also going to talk about what you can do to begin applying the superpower capabilities in your company, in your job search. And we're going to wrap up with why becoming a superpower-enabled financial executive makes you more valuable. So, in the promotional material for this, I kind of laid out 9/11, the financial collapse in 2008, COVID, Apollo 13, US Air 1549, which was the miracle on the Hudson. And each one of these was a pretty unexpected, previously unseen and systemic disruption. Systemic, whether it was within the spacecraft, the plane, or systemic in terms of affecting things globally, like the recession did in COVID in 9/11. Now, these are things that were newsworthy. They affected things on multiple dimensions. And a number of these had what I call rippling or cascading effects. I mean, even with Apollo 13, one thing went wrong, led to another thing going wrong, to another thing going wrong. And you can kind of track a similar cascading events, as you think about COVID. Now, what's interesting, a lot of people say, oh, these things only happen once in 100 years. But when you think about it, how many 1 in 100-year events have occurred in the last 20 years? I mean, you think about Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, you think about some of the stuff around climate change and, some of the crazy weather we're having. You think about the power grid disruption in Houston. All of these things impact, us in a variety of ways. And it's not just about the big stuff, but disruption and uncertainty happens all around us. And it happens at many levels. To start off with, it happens in our companies. And at least with our companies, we have some level, not perfect, but some level of control. So if you're going to change the financial system, you've got some control over when that's going to happen, how your people are going to be impacted. If you end up being the acquirer versus the acquiree, you have some control over how things get done. So that's the first level of change. I mean, that can be succession planning, that can be a variety of things. As you get out to the next level, you're really looking at your ecosystem. And in your ecosystem, you only have an ability to influence. Now, if you think about your ecosystem, that includes your customers, and maybe their preferences are changing. Or if you think about during COVID, their buying behavior was changing. What they were able to do was changing. Now, you might be able to influence that through your offerings, how you deliver, how you provide your service, but you're not in control. Your competitors, there might be issues with your distributors or channel partners. Again, you can influence, but you don't have control. And in the third level is really looking at the environment, kind of the macro side of things. And there you have no control. None of us had any control over COVID. Pretty much the world is finding out they don't have a whole lot of control over the Ukraine conflict, and certainly not so much over inflation. So I think one of my favorite sayings, and actually two. So first, you have to understand this is the world we're in, and disruption and uncertainty are the new normal. So paying attention to these things is important. I had a client who once told me the worst thing you can do is ignore things like this. He said, there is nothing worse than bad news late. Because if you get it late, chances are you're behind and you're already in trouble. And the second quote I like to raise here is, you don't get to choose your circumstances, but you do get to choose how you're going to respond. And I think that's very important to remember, is a lot of times, we take the position of we're the victim, we're the captive, we can't do anything. But we always have that choice. And if we exercise that agency, we can change how we approach things. It's also important to note that, disruptions often reveal weaknesses. And if you think about disruptions, they're disruptions because they've upset us somehow. They've interrupted us somehow. And usually there's a reason that we've been disrupted. Some things are in our control, some things are not, but very often, if you think about, recent disruptions and, even before that, very often it's because we see things or recognize things too late. That can be something if you go back and you think about Blockbuster and Netflix or Kodak and Fuji, the signs were there in both cases, but the incumbent chose not to see, not to recognize. I think the second weakness that gets revealed is very often there's reliance on past approaches. We try, even in the face of disruption, we try and stick to our plan. We try to still do things the way we've always done them because that's how we've been successful. The thing is, when conditions change, that's not necessarily the case. I think third is not really understanding the risk environment. You might be looking at a risk in isolation, something like, well, what if we have a warehouse fire? What if we have a cyber breach? But you'll see as we go through today's presentation that you have to look at the whole thing. You have to look at how the risks are interrelated and interact. And as we saw with COVID, multiple levels of risk. We have to be careful about having mechanistic or linear thinking. We do that one A, then B will happen, then C, because things are much more systemic. They're systems, and you tweak one thing, three things change. I say historically, certainly over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a heavy focus, hyper focus almost, on efficiency and running things so tight, offshoring, that we didn't invest in resiliency and preparedness. And when you run things that tight, as I told my boys when I was teaching them to drive, if you go over a pothole at 10 miles an hour, you'll feel it, but you're not going to do a whole lot of damage. If you're going at 60 miles an hour, bad things are going to happen when you hit that big pothole. So it's important to look at those things. So I want to launch our first poll. And, in this poll, and as we think about the polls and the discussions today, think about your current or your most recent company. Joyce, if we can launch the first poll. So you're going to see two questions. The first one is disruption and uncertainty will continue to be a significant factor for our leaders in our organizations over the next 3 to 5 years, and rate how strongly you agree or disagree. And then once we do that one, the second question as you scroll down is at the statement, we are prepared for the disruption and uncertainty we are likely to face in the next 5 years. So one is kind of looking out to the future, and the other is saying, are we ready for this? So we'll give folks a few minutes, a minute or so to do that. I see there's a timer there, so why don't we go out to about a minute and a half, so another 30 seconds if folks would key in their responses. Okay, so let's see what we have here on the first poll. Let's see, 5 out of 7. 5 out of 7 are showing, that they agree or strongly agree that disruption and uncertainty are going to continue to be a significant factor. Now I see 2 people who strongly disagree. When we open up this for chat later, be curious to why you don't think that's going to be a factor. So if we scroll down to the next question about how we're prepared, Joyce, so if you would just scroll down on that.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Yep. So, here I was asking, how prepared are we? And let's see, it's kind of a mix. I'd say the largest portion, 5 out of 7, are either unsure, disagree. We've got some folks who are saying they agree, and I think preparedness has definitely improved. since we've gone through COVID, folks have learned things. So we can close down the poll. We're going to move on to the next slide. And actually the slide after that. Okay. So when we think about the challenges of leading under uncertainty and disruption, we're very often challenged. We have to navigate different tensions. And sometimes, these are actual paradoxes, things that actually oppose each other. So if we think back, earlier in time, that, we used to say we can deliver something at high price, or we can deliver high quality. We can do something and deliver something quickly, but it's going to be expensive, or we can do it slowly and it's going to be cheaper. The reality is now, our customers, we ourselves, we don't want that choice. We want low price and high quality. We want it quick and we want it cheap. So companies are having to respond, and instead of saying either or thinking about, okay, this is a choice, I can do this or that when you're faced with disruption and uncertainty and you're faced with certain tensions, you really have to shift to what I call both and thinking. It's not choosing one or the other. It's how do I choose both? And instead of saying, which, we all do this, oh, we can't do that. You go back and somebody probably said, hey, there's no way we can do things quick and cheap. There's no way that'll work. Well, somebody figured it out, and, you get more creative. And this idea of both and, if you think about the concept of yin and yang, it's the coexistence of black and white. You don't see any gray, because what gray indicates is compromise. And sometimes you have to do that. But if you can avoid it, compromise means we've both given something up. So instead of saying we can't do something, ask how we can do it. I think it's important to find that third option or fourth option. And that when you do both and thinking, you get the benefits of both sides, and the negatives of either side tend to go away. My favorite one, and it's my favorite candy, is Reese's peanut butter cups. So you didn't have to choose between peanut butter or chocolate. You actually got to eat both. If you think about Amazon, this idea of both and, the Prime membership, you can get all your shipping for free, second-day delivery. If you think about Southwest Airlines, they figured out how to have lower prices, flexibility with flights, and they can throw in 2 bags. So that's something, other airlines are, a challenge to figure out how to do. So to thrive in a turbulent environment, it's important that we begin to do things differently. And it starts with seeing things differently. And that means looking at things, fresh set of eyes from different perspectives. It's where you look. It's also important, as you take that information in, to think differently and consider, is the model, is the framework you're using the right one? And seeing and thinking differently is great, but it doesn't matter until you actually do something differently. And this goes back and forth, because as we do differently, we learn, we have to think differently, we have to see differently. So it's this constant back and forth. If we don't, the definition of insanity, according to Einstein, was doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So if we see, think, and do differently, we're going to be better prepared for the future. So as we continue our discussion today, I want you to keep a few things in mind. First, as I mentioned earlier, keep your current company or your most recent company in mind. And I want you to consider, are you facing similar challenges? And as you learn about the superpowers, how would each of these superpowers help your organization be better prepared, be better able to weather disruptions and uncertainty? Think about whether your organization or whether you yourself have that capability. And as you see all 5 superpowers, which one or two are the most important for you or your organization to work on? And why is it important to do that? What's the value you're going to get? And I'm going to be talking about value from each of the superpowers as we go through this. And also, not just that it's important, but you're going to learn a few things about what you can do to begin to build or improve that superpower. So, as we think about disruption and change, new capabilities are needed. We can't do things the old way. So that's where the superpowers come in. And I developed this framework a little over a year ago. The superpowers are not meant to replace your core leadership, your core management capabilities, financial planning, strategic planning, all those types of things. But I think of the superpowers as a set of capabilities that overlays that. They're capabilities that enable you to see, think, and do differently, to do all the core things better than you did before. And as we go through the superpowers, you're going to see that each one represents a tension or a paradox where you need to work and consider both sides. And it's also important as you go through this that, navigating those paradoxes is really around both and leadership. And there have been studies done that say the folks who can navigate those paradoxes, who can handle both and thinking, that tends to be predictive of higher performance. So let's go and introduce the 5 superpowers. The first one is present futurist. So it's balancing that tension about focusing on the present and on the future. If you only focus on one, it means you're not paying attention to the other, and that's dangerous. The second one is being an experienced learner. So we've talked about, the value of experience. In some cases, it's very valuable. In other cases, that experience actually gets in the way of learning new things. So it's important to recognize, leveraging that experience, but also taking the time to learn. The next one is being a prepared risk taker. Now, people say, oh, I can be prepared or I can be a risk taker. The reality is, in this type of environment, you need to be both. Now, you can't spend all your time preparing, and never acting and never taking a risk. And conversely, you can't do it the other way. You need to look at both, and preparing sometimes actually enables risk taking or enables you to absorb or handle more risk. Next is strategic executor. So it's the ability to balance strategy and execution, or strategy and operations. It's recognizing that they're linked together. So you can't really have a discussion about one without talking about the other. And the last superpower we're going to discuss of the 5 is called an accountable collaborator. So a lot of people say, oh, if we're collaborating, if there's a team, well, who do we hold accountable? Well, it's a team that's accountable. The people who are collaborating are accountable. And we'll talk about how you do that and how it's focused on outcomes. So as you look at the 5 leadership superpowers, it's my position that you've really got to be proficient as a leadership team in all five. Now, as individuals, you don't need all five. You might be really good at 2 or 1, but you should at least acknowledge and be aware how the others work. As we talk about the superpowers, you're going to see how it changes the conversation a leadership team has. It changes the conversation as you look at some of the tensions, the disruptions, the uncertainty you're facing. And it's not just one and done. Maintaining and improving the superpowers is very important. So let's jump in. So we're going to talk about first about being a present futurist. So if you're a present futurist, you're going to have and maintain an understanding of what's going on in the present. You're going to understand the dynamics of the environment. You're not going to be looking at things with blinders, but you're going to have that broader perspective. You're going to be paying attention to signals and trends to gather insights about the future. If you're a present futurist, you're going to be a leader who envisions where your company is going. What is that future state? Now, that future state isn't guaranteed when you're in disruption and uncertainty, which is why it's so important to synthesize that understanding of the present, what the outlook is for the future, with your desired future to say, how do I make this all work together? So if you're doing these things, you're going to be better able to anticipate the future. And that's a real benefit. You're not going to be surprised as often. And because you're doing these things, you're going to reduce the uncertainty you face. You're never going to be able to eliminate that uncertainty, but if you're paying attention, you're going to know more. And as a finance executive, we always like to get perfect information. We like things to be accurate, but in an uncertain, disruptive environment, we have to get comfortable with just enough, to be able to tell a story, to be able to, provide decision support, to help with planning. It becomes a lot more than about the numbers. So how do you become a present futurist? I think the first thing I talk about is looking at things from different perspectives. Well, what does that mean? I think it's important to look at things from your supplier's perspective to get a sense of what are the challenges that they're facing. How is that going to impact your future? To look at things from your customer's viewpoint. What are the challenges that they're facing that impact how they interact with your business? Looking at your employees, we're all aware of the Great Resignation. How are your employees seeing things? And it's not just today, but it's going into the future. It's important, probably more so than ever, to regularly scan the environment. You want to start to learn what are the emerging trends. More things online, more e-commerce is certainly something we saw over the last couple of years. I think I heard that in the last 2 years, the growth rate of e-commerce was what was expected over 5 or 6 years. So it's paying attention to those trends, identifying warning signals, figuring out what's most important to monitor, because you're paying attention to what kind of impact that can have and reporting on that. And that's an ongoing discussion. It's not just something you do once a year. The sooner you see something, the sooner you understand something, the faster you can act. When we talk about defining the future, I think you want to make an illustration. You want to make it relatable. So, if you think about, I'll use Publix as an example, and they talk about their desired future state. They talk about making shopping a pleasure. They have a picture of what that shopping experience is supposed to be like. how the interaction is with the different departments around the store and how people work together to deliver that experience. So it's not just about numbers, but it's about that bigger picture. And then you can look at how those different forces interact. And it's about the ability to pull that together. And as a finance executive, you've got to be able to tell that story. As you're talking to investors, as you're talking to your board, and the numbers by themselves don't tell the story. It's the story that justifies the numbers or tells you why the numbers need to change. Next is experienced learner. So, an experienced learner, if you think about critical capabilities, is they leverage what they know, but they also challenge what they know. And they do that because they realize if they over rely on experience and expertise, that can actually hurt them because things have changed. So they not only challenge themselves, but as experienced learners, they're also open to being challenged by others. And they need to make it safe so people do that so they can see how they can improve. They welcome debate. They don't feel threatened by it. And this idea about, being open to learning, and experienced learners are curious. So if you think about curiosity, and I think there was a statistic I saw that the ages when people ask the most questions is usually between the ages of 4 and 6. And if any of you have had kids, it's why, what, how, why are we doing this? Do we have to do this? So they're asking all those questions, but as they start to go to school, it's we're judged by what we know, not by what we ask. Well, when you're in a world of disruption and uncertainty, you've got to reverse the age curve, so to speak, and go back to asking questions, because it's through asking questions that we learn and understand how to solve problems. Being an experienced learner means it's not just about the leadership team. You want to engage others in the discussion. And when I talk about engaging others, look at the value these people bring. It's not just about their position or function. Frontline people can tell you a whole lot more about customers and what's really happening in their lives than marketing is able to. It's important to acknowledge that it's okay to say, I don't know, but that we together as a group can figure it out. And we often talk about continuous improvement. It's equally important to talk about continuous learning and getting better at how to learn and through different modes. Now, if you're doing that, you're going to be much more able to understand and frame the challenges that we're facing. And sometimes being able to frame that challenge, think about that challenge differently is the key to actually solving it. Having a learning mindset. We talked about being welcoming debate, being open to being challenged. That increases the psychological safety in your organization. When people feel safe, they engage more. And when they feel safe and they engage, they also trust more. And that's a far healthier organization. And if you're doing these things, you're going to adapt and respond faster. So flexibility matters and speed matters. And the idea that you are embracing versus fearing disruption and uncertainty makes it a lot easier. If you're afraid, you're not going to act. And if you don't act, you're going to get into trouble. So how do you get better at doing this? I think the first thing starts with challenging our approaches, our models, and our assumptions. That the assumption you might have said, we're going to grow 5% every year. Well, that's not going to happen because your customers are changing, their needs are changing. the business models that we developed, let's just think about restaurants. It was all about going into the restaurant. Well, a lot of these restaurants had to rethink their business model and think about delivery, or think about selling the raw materials and becoming, almost mini grocery stores. And, challenging that thinking and, recognizing sometimes you have to adapt. Sometimes you have to actually discard something, stop doing it. Sometimes you have to build something new. It's also about seeking a diversity of views. Now that comes from a diversity of people, comes from a diversity of perspectives. The one thing I know is if you ask the same people the same questions, you're likely to get the same answers. So as you invite people in, as you ask and invite questions, you're going to get better and broader information and additional perspectives. And this idea about anticipating and identifying the capabilities you're going to need. The one thing we're finding out is that capabilities get stale faster than ever before. You have to be looking and exploring the edges, of technology, of change, asking questions about, a few years back, whoever thought about AI, whoever thought about blockchain, or how fast things are accelerating digitally. So it's not just, what do I need to do the job today, but what are the different things I need to learn? Now, I think it's important that training is not just about your job. It's not about how to do something, but it's about how to think, and how to think is critical. And there's a difference, I like to say, between training and education. Now, some of you might find this funny. Hopefully none of you will be offended by this. But, if your child came home from school and they're in 6th grade and they said, hey, mom and dad, we're going to start having sex training, you'd probably be pretty upset. But if they came home and said sex education, that's giving them the tools to think, to be responsible adults, to make, wise choices. So education is something that helps you. It's thinking about learning, not just in time, but learning just in case. And, when I talk about looking at, related and tangential information, I'll simply say that learning outside the box helps you think outside the box. And sometimes, when you look at different situations, something as simple as, Ted Lasso might give you an idea for something you can do with your team. The next one is being a prepared risk taker. And part of being prepared means improving your understanding of risk. And it's also about looking at those risks holistically, because they're interconnected. It's about not just risks, but about opportunities as well. And thinking about the interdependencies between them. And as you look at that more holistically, you get a sense of what is the range of potential scenarios and risks you need to consider. Now, I'll be the first one to say no one could have been prepared for COVID. But what I would say is that most organizations could have been better prepared for disruptions in general. So increasing that overall level of preparedness is, really important, building in that resiliency. And at the same time, there are probably going to be certain risks that you want to prepare specifically for. And those are the ones, that become more existential. The impact of those risks are high. They might be low probability, but even in that case, it's important at least to think through them. And if you're doing that, you're going to be able to make faster, more informed decisions and act. And I think lastly, being a prepared risk taker is not just about risk management, but risk is a part of business. And taking risks is how you grow, is how you innovate. So how does that help you? So first, we all know offense scores points, defense doesn't. And being a prepared risk taker gives you a head start. If you're a prepared risk taker, instead of being knocked over by the disruption, you're going to be better able to withstand that initial shock. You're not going to be forced to react. You're going to be able to move forward more thoughtfully and faster. And then as you think about preparedness and resilience, it's kind of like insurance, but for the disruptions you can't get insurance for. And insurance has no upside. But if you're prepared, you're going to be able to pounce on opportunities faster. And on the downside, if you're prepared, you're dampening that downside risk. And unlike insurance, insurance doesn't build your capabilities, but being prepared does. Now, we can't eliminate risk, but we can diminish it and reduce our risk profile because of what we understand and how we prepare. So, if you think about being a prepared risk taker, I think a great example is, if you think about the special forces and the missions they have, for most of us, we'd probably get killed if we attempted those missions. But because of the level of preparation they take, because of how they train, because of how they work together and that preparedness, it makes that risk much more tolerable. On the other hand, if we're not prepared, that's when you run into trouble. If you think about some of the power outages, I guess it was last year in Houston, because of how they put their power grid together. And they never planned for extremes in weather, which are now more and more likely to happen. As a finance leader, as a CFO, this idea of talking about risk, about preparing for risk is something that's important to talk with your leadership team. It's also something your board is going to be asking more questions about. They want to get a better handle on risk and how it's being managed. And the more you can show this, the greater confidence they're going to have. So how do you do this? I think first and foremost, you seek out and you're receptive to risk information. People shouldn't be afraid to raise risks. It's the stuff you don't know that's going to hurt you. So this idea of, who looks out for risk? Everybody does. It's not just the finance department. It's not just the risk management group. It's not just senior people. Everybody has some insights to offer. Now, it doesn't mean we pay attention to all of these, but at least that way you can start filtering through what's important. How you assess risks needs to be different. Historically, if you look at a 10K, if you think about insurance, you tend to insure for common incidents, named risks, fires, cyber breaches, workplace violence or something like that. But I think it's important to look at the drivers to your business, what makes your business successful. If I'm in a hotel chain, occupancy is a driver of success. Now, while I might think, and I might have had the pandemic as item number 20 on my list of risks, and I never really gave it much thought. But if you think about occupancy and say, what are all the risks to occupancy? Well, pandemic's one, terrorism is one, businesses not having conferences is another. So there's a whole host of things. So if we look at drivers and look at the risks to those drivers, we're also going to have a different perspective. It's important to integrate your discussions around strategy, how you're performing, and risk, because they interact. And in the same way you track performance indicators, you also want to look at risk indicators so you have an idea and a better sense of what might happen. When we talk about improving overall preparedness, there are low, no regret moves that can help you be better prepared in general. I mean, think about it. We all keep batteries in our house in case the power goes out. Publix, Home Depot, all these places stock up on generators. So when something happens, you're able to handle that. You know, you would never think of going on a boat without having life jackets or flotation devices. These are all low and no regret moves that put us in a better state of preparedness. And it's important, you know, as we're prepared risk takers, to consider, you know, the overall sense of risk. So sometimes there's risk in making a decision, and there's also risk in not making a decision and not acting. But sometimes we don't think about what's the risk of inaction. We only think about what's the risk if we do something. So it's important to look at both sides. Next is being a strategic executor. And just so you guys know, I know I'm probably doing a little more talking. We're going to open it up for questions soon. I got a little bit behind on a couple of slides, so I just wanted to let you know I'm aware of that. Trying to do a little bit of catching up. But being a strategic executor, it's important to recognize that strategy and execution are one integrated conversation, and the folks who are developing strategy need to understand operations and vice versa. I think it's important when you're in a crisis situation, when you're under pressure, that you consider the implications of short-term decisions. You know, are they going to impact your long-term? So if you're a strategic executor, you're thinking about those implications of operational decisions on strategy and strategy decisions on operations. This idea about execution aligned with strategy. Are you putting your money where your strategy is, your resources, your effort? And, you know, to this last point, you know, strategy can't be locked in stone. A plan can't be locked in stone. I mean, there was a quote I saw recently that says, strategy and plans crafted in stone in times of flux are dangerous. You know, a lot of companies quickly recognized they had to throw out the plan. They had to throw out, you know, what their goals were for the year, and they had to adjust and adapt. Now, if you're doing that, you're able to keep your focus on strategy and stay true to your purpose. If you think about what Delta has done over the last couple of years, the CEO, you know, came on and said, you know, we're not going to have a normal strategic plan. It just makes no sense. We've never been in this environment, but we are going to focus on our principles, and we're going to focus on our values, focus on employee safety and keeping employees engaged, focus on keeping the customer healthy, keeping a focus on things being safe. You know, if you're a strategic executor, you're making better decisions and you're balancing the short and the long term. Now, we all know, if we think back to last summer with the rental car market, a lot of the rental car companies, they cut to the bone, they got rid of all their vehicles. They weren't thinking about, well, what happens when things get better? If you're a strategic executor, you're considering those things. And if you're better at execution, you're going to get a better return on your strategy. And this idea about being responsive versus reactive, you know, the more we're able to be purposeful. Responsive involves some level of thinking, where reaction tends to be more emotional. So when we talk about how to do this, we've already mentioned what Delta did about being principle and direction driven in terms of what's important. It's important to prioritize and focus on what is mission critical. And if it's not mission critical, then we need to stop it. And that's how we save resources by, you know, we're not cutting our nose to spite our face. We're cutting out the things that don't matter. As a strategic executor, being able to think about different scenarios and how things might play out, what's going to happen when travel improves? What's going to happen when people start having conferences again? So if we think about those implications, we're less apt to make short-sighted decisions. It's important, and a lot of companies recognize this early on, is they got rid of the barriers that were hindering their organizations from adapting. And that barrier might be, where previously we might have focused on an operating plan or on a budget, that didn't matter anymore, under these circumstances. So we had to get rid of those barriers. It's also, thinking about strategic planning and reviewing strategy is not something that you just do once a year. When change is happening so quickly, you might need to revisit these things on a monthly or quarterly basis. Doesn't mean you change everything, but you recognize that you need to adapt. The last superpower we're going to talk about is being an accountable collaborator. Now, a lot of people, say, well, how can we be accountable? How can a group be accountable? But the reality is, to get a lot of things done today, you have to collaborate across boundaries. That might be across functions in your organization. It might mean working with partners. It might mean working with suppliers to solve those complex challenges. And what's important is to get the right people in the room working on the right problem. Accountability comes in because you're focused on delivering outcomes, and it's outcomes that matter. And it's the team that's held accountable for outcomes. You recognize individuals can't do that alone, but the team is allowed to self-govern itself, and the team holds their counterparts accountable for the roles they're supposed to fulfill, and they support each other in doing that. So if you're an accountable collaborator, you're going to be more flexible. You're going to be able to adapt and pivot to disruption. Again, if you think about special forces, something disrupts something, they improvise and they pivot. That commitment to achieving outcomes is something that everybody on the team owns, and they're very engaged. And that also helps them build stronger relations and stronger networks that can benefit the company later on. And if we get rid of the barriers, we get rid of the silos, you see that those just get in the way. So then it becomes the norm that collaboration, working across boundaries, becomes a permanent part of what we do. And it's recognizing the team is greater than the sum of its parts. So, I mean, if you think about, just by way of examples, I think sports are a great way to think about accountable collaboration. If you think about soccer, football, basketball, everything is the team. It's not about individual performance. It's about whether or not the team wins. We talked about special forces. If you think about anybody who's been to Disney, they are all working together to deliver that amazing experience for their visitors. And that's the outcome they're shooting for. How do you do it? Well, I think the first thing is you have to say, do we actually need to collaborate? Is this something that, that a team could do on its own? Because collaboration isn't required for everything. But when it is, you want to be ready to do it. You want to have the right people on the team. And it's not based on, what department they're from, what level they're on. The question is, do they have the capabilities? And do they add value for what the team is trying to do? You become a better accountable collaborator when there is alignment and agreement on the outcomes. You're transparent. There's no hidden agendas. Communications are open. Information is shared. That builds trust. And that trust helps the team work better together. It's important to recognize and reward the behaviors that you want in winning. You don't want to tolerate bad behavior because that will come back to bite you. So I'm gonna break for a second here, and I want to roll out the last poll. So now that we've talked about all 5 of the superpowers, and if you remember, the question I posed at the beginning, which are the 1 or 2? And you can choose more than one as you select here. But what are the 1 or 2 that are most important for you or your organization to work on going forward? So let's take a minute and let's see what folks have to say as what's important to work on. So has everybody, casted their votes? Let's take another 20 seconds here. It's interesting what we're seeing here. This idea about being a present futurist. I suspect folks recognize the need to know more about what's going on today, more about the environment, and equally important, about the future. I think companies have also seen the importance of being a strategic executor. So making sure we don't make short-sighted decisions, that operations doesn't crowd out strategy, but they're both thought of. And this idea about working across boundaries with being an accountable collaborator. So thanks for answering that. Let's go on to so now we've talked about all the 5 superpowers. Now I think, as we've discussed these, you've seen how each of the superpowers work, but I think you're also seeing how they support each other. If you're a present futurist, that futurist side is going to help tell you what you need to learn. What risks do you need to prepare for? When you're thinking about preparedness, what do you have to execute? What do you have to do differently? How do you become prepared? Very often involves collaboration. So each of these inform and support the other. When you have all of these working together, the benefit is multiplicative. Now, I want to bring this back for a second. How is this personally relevant to you as a finance executive? Whether you're looking to get promoted, whether you're looking to transition into a new position, hiring managers, I would think, would want to think about not just hiring people based on what they did, what their history was, but the question is, what can they do under uncertain and disruptive conditions? Now, they're not going to say, hey, are you a present futurist? But they should be asking about how you've managed these different tensions that we've talked about. And they should look for examples. If you're a hiring manager and you're hiring, a director of FP&A, you want to get a sense of how that person has dealt with uncertainty. What have they done to help prepare their company for risk? If you're a candidate, I think it's important to show, when we talk about showing capabilities, don't just talk about history, but talk about how you survived and thrived in the face of disruption and uncertainty. What did you do differently? How did you deliver more value? And to be able to talk about, even if it's hypothetically, how you would address situations that company might face. So tying that all together, we started with a discussion around disruption and uncertainty, and we talked about big and small disruptions. We talked about disruptions and uncertainty aren't going away and why we need new capabilities. And as you can see here, on the left-hand side, those capabilities become really, really important in the face of disruption and uncertainty. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see the benefits of the superpowers. So it's important to start building and or strengthening your superpowers today. And the question is, are you ready to do that? So before we wrap up and open it up for questions, a couple of quick housekeeping things. First, it was a question, a favorite of me, can you help me? I recently developed a leadership team future readiness survey based on the 5 superpowers. And I'm looking for volunteers who will take the survey. Probably takes about 15 or 20 minutes. If you take the survey, I'm going to share the aggregate results to you in a summary report, and you'll be invited to a webinar. You don't have to attend if you don't want to, but that way you'll hear, from 20, 30, 40 people, what were the insights that came out of the survey? More importantly, I'm looking for feedback on the survey. So you'll be sent a short questionnaire to talk about, what was the experience like? Were the questions hard? Was anything confusing? So if you're willing to do this, want to learn more, you can email me at j@jweiser.com. And as highlighted in the bottom, you're not going to be solicited. This is purely about getting data and making sure the instrument works. So if you want to learn more, here's how. And I know Joyce is going to send out the prior slide and this slide, as well as a slide that shows all 5 superpowers. So you have that and can actually click on the links. But I'm offering a free discovery call to folks who are in attendance today. If you want to talk about your situation, learn more about the superpowers. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, you're going to have access to numerous articles, podcasts, and other presentations. And a number of these are also on my website. And if you're looking for copies of today's slides, or you want to learn about upcoming events like those listed on the right, again, please email me. So let me stop sharing. I apologize for going a little bit long there. And I want to open this up for questions. So I know there have probably been some questions in chat. So I guess, Tom, maybe if you can share those.
Yeah, one I got early on was, are these learned qualities, the superpowers, or are they intrinsic to the roles or typical leaders in an organization?
So I think in some cases, some people think this way naturally, but I think all of the superpowers are things that can be learned, that you can get educated on, that you can practice, that you can start to make into habits. So, nobody's left out here. Other questions? And feel free to unmute yourself as well. Were there other questions in chat?
I'm looking. Others can keep me honest, but I don't see anything.
So, for the folks that are here, what do you think you can do, starting tomorrow about the superpowers? Is there a superpower or a situation, just with disruption or uncertainty, that you're facing? You're like, I need help on this, and share with your colleagues, because chances are they're facing something similar.
Hey, Jay, this is Rob D'Amico. How are you?
Good to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you too. Thank you for the presentation. A lot of great information. I think I'll share. I'll open up the floor here, since I see it's a predominantly mature group that's joined. And so, I think we all have kind of learned about how to deal with uncertainty in our careers and the companies that we've worked for. And I worked for a major rent-a-car company. You brought up rent-a-cars, and I worked for one of those major rent-a-car companies for decades. And at the time, we had a parent company, and we were one of 5 conglomerates under the parent. And that CEO of that parent company was very focused on the uncertainty in the environment around us. And he strategized and pushed us to what would we do if our systems went down. And
Sure.
being a finance guy, it's like, okay, well, how are we going to get the business plan done? How are we going to report the monthly results? Where are we going to get it from? How are we going to? So I think each of our experiences in life and the businesses that we worked for may have kind of given us a heads up about how to be a little bit more flexible in this uncertainty. And I would say that the other thing that comes to my mind is that when the pandemic hit, and in the beginning, we were all rather uncertain about what was going to come and how we were going to deal with it. And to calm people, I actually used the term, it's not so much about our uncertainty anymore. It's what level of risk are you willing to take? So get out of the fear mode and think about applying yourself in a risk mode. And that's just a couple of things that pop into my mind. Hopefully that.
No, I mean, that's insightful. And I'm glad I didn't say anything bad about any car companies. But, your thing is, risks are there, and the question is, what can you tolerate? What can you accept? How can you increase that tolerance? How can you better withstand some of those shocks, because you're better prepared, because you gave yourself a little bit of wiggle room, because, you can pivot faster, is important. And, the reality is we're not going back to the way it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. That pace of change, that disruption, I mean, uncertainty is the norm. So, the question is how do we succeed in that environment? And, you mentioned it's, a more mature group. I heard old for a moment, but then I quickly got that out of my head. Mature. That has a variety of connotations.
It does.
But the point is, I have a 25-year-old son. He's having to deal with different disruptions and uncertainty. He sees what his parents are dealing with. My wife's a teacher in Fulton County, and the school system had its share of disruptions and uncertainty. But the fact of the matter is, she still has to have certain preparedness plans in place. What happens if? So I think, history helps us, but a lot of disruptions and uncertainty we're facing are new. So if we think about how do we approach it before, when it was unknown, I think, that's important. Other questions, other comments?
Gary's going to have a comment. Come on, Gary.
I was kind of focused in on the, I think it was the teamwork one. I think you called it accountable collaborator.
Yes.
Really like that one a lot. It's just, I think especially when you're dealing with uncertainty and things are changing and you have to adapt. I think it works a lot better if you have a team that's in place that can work together. If you have different situations call for different things, but that one, I think it's just together, everyone achieves more, right, team? I think when people work collaboratively and work together, you're more resilient, you're more flexible, you're more agile, more adaptable. So that was the one thing that I kind of focused in on when you were going through that.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting. A lot of people, jump to that one. A lot of people jump to prepared risk taker. With the accountable collaborator piece, what really got me thinking about that is, a number of my clients have had executives who have said, I need to know who to point the finger at. I need to know who to blame if something goes wrong. Well, that's a punitive environment. That's not inviting people in. That's not making it safe. And, do you want to collaborate? If I'm going to get blamed, you're going to get blamed. If you start to take that out, then you can work better together. And it's the group, because the fact of the matter is, as an individual, I can't make that happen by myself. The team makes it happen. So Gary, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad you shared that.
I'm going to share another one for you. And I stepped away because I was looking for the book. And we had at Robert Half, I didn't have the opportunity to be invited to it, but it was a training seminar. And it's escaping me what the name of the book was and who the author of it was. But it was an individual who made it to the top of Mount Everest. And basically the gist of the story is that each person has an accountability within the team to do their specific role. And if they don't do their role, especially in an event like climbing Mount Everest, you're going to die. So you got to stick to what your responsibility is. And I really try to implore that with my team at Robert Half. Not an easy thing to do by any means. You know, people are constantly working outside their lines, drifting outside the lines, and not in a way, like you said, of thinking outside the box, but drifting outside their lines. And if you do that in climbing Mount Everest, you're not going to get there. You know, who's handling the provisions, who's handling putting the tent up, who's handling this. And it was really, in my mind, a great way to team build, collaborate, build, to be successful in something that you want to work on. And I try to reflect on that often, but kind of a challenge working 100% remote.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, you know, some of the situations when you talk about disruption and uncertainty, you know, I'll put in quotes, are life or death. Some of them actually are life or death when you're thinking about some of the stuff with COVID. Some of it, you know, you're putting your company at risk. So it's life or death, you know, for your company. You have to think like an owner. You have to think about, you know, what's that ultimate outcome you're trying to achieve. And, you know, I think what you just talked about with Mount Everest, I think points to a set of principles. And it's those principles that become so important when you think about being an accountable collaborator.
Mm-hmm.
Other comments or questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, one, having just recently gone on the interview process, and this may help others, is the concept of experienced learner, or, you know, growth mindset. You know, what have you done recently that's expanding your knowledge base, so you're not in that mindset of, yeah, we've always done it this way, or, you know, you're not keeping up with whether it's, you know, big economic game changers or subtleties that your staff may deal with software. You know, employers are really eager to hear, you know, how we all stay current. And, you know, given, I'll use Rob's word, the maturity of the audience, that's always something that we need to stay, you know, mindful of as we try to, you know, just erase any preconceived notions people may have about those of us who've been in the field a while.
You know, one of the things in this other group I'm in, the gentleman in the quote was, you know, if you're not learning and growing, you're decaying.
Yeah.
And as professionals, we can't afford to decay. Our companies cannot afford a decaying organization. You know, so that learning, I mean, it's interesting. As I said, my wife's an educator. My two boys see my wife and I reading, learning, practicing, and it's something that they've made part of their lives, and it's helped make them successful. So, you know, for part of this is, you know, how do you help the people that work for you? How do you model that behavior? How do you encourage your fellow leaders to do those things? You know, it's easy to say, oh, I don't have time, but can you afford not to?
Yeah, I want to dovetail on that just a little bit. The saying I think you're trying to say was, if you're not green and growing, you're ripe and rotting, right? You've heard that before. So very true. But you said something, and I wrote it down. I thought it was so important. You said that continuous learning is just as important as continuous improvement. And you know, at the workplace, you're always focused on continuous improvement, right? But it seems like that continuous learning always gets pushed by the wayside. I'm just working on a professional development budget for this year, and we didn't spend hardly any of that money for last year. We did a couple of things, but not much. And you know, you said you're too busy. You know, the other cliche is like you're too busy driving to stop for gasoline, right? You need to stop every once in a while and you know, make time to make yourself better. So you know, Tom, that was a really good point that I thought you brought up. And yeah, I thought it was so important when you talked about learning being just as important as improvement, because we're always working on improvements and process improvements and doing things better and faster and more accurately, but we don't really work as much on you know, making our workers better.
Yeah, you know, and the thing that's interesting is you're not going to be able to continuously improve unless you're improving yourself. And you know, there's a quote, and I hope I don't mess this up, but you know, it was, you know, a finance person, I think, so I don't want to malign anybody here, but you know, said, you know, we can't afford to do training. What if people leave? And the response is, well, what if we don't train them and they stay? I mean, think about that. You know, that, you know, making that investment, you know, you invest in upgrading your operating system, you invest in upgrading your technology. Who do you think runs the business every day? Who's talking to customers every day? Who's making decisions? Well, if you don't upgrade that part of the business, you're going to be in trouble.
So we have a hard stop at 6:30, so we have time for one more question of Jay. And
I'll chime in if I may. Thank you, Jay, for hi. Thank you for a great presentation, and you know, also I've heard some great comments. I actually have two questions, if I may. First is, you mentioned principles, and I'm curious. Is the I guess having kind of like a moral compass or like a value systems part of, is that, you know, does that fit in any part of this leadership framework? And the second question is, and I think it's something that you sort of touched on, and you know, it's I think in response to somebody else's question, and you know, whether these are innate or learned skills. And I'm curious. I'm imagining it's kind of a, you know, for some people it's kind of a mix of both or whatnot, but your thoughts on, you know, maybe the kinds of experiences that you've seen that have helped to enable or develop these skills the most, and you know, in what you think to be kind of like these super leaders.
Sure. So your first question was talking about principles and values, and you know, I think at the core, you know, that helps define a leader. Now, when I was also talking about principles, sometimes you know, in the case of Delta, they said we can't develop our normal operating plan. They call it a flight plan, but they said we're going to be guided by our principles. So there were principles, the guardrails that define their strategy. What was important? Passenger safety, you know, focusing and delivering value to the customer, taking care of their employees. So it was those kind of strategic principles and core values that could guide the business in the absence of a formal plan, because things were in so much flux, you couldn't do that. Yeah, I think the second part of your question, you know, in terms of experience, you know, I think folks learn by doing. And, you know, in dealing with a lot of the stuff around COVID, you know, I think we all learned a little bit about epidemiology and how viruses work. And that was helpful to understand things. We all took time, hopefully, to, you know, look the Ukraine situation right now. If you're paying attention in the newspaper, I mean, there's a horrible stuff that's going on there. But if you're in a company and you're not asking yourself, how is this going to impact me? What's going to happen when interest rates go up? What's going to happen with inflation? If fuel goes up, impacting trade in Europe. So it's having an interest in that. And if somebody says, oh, well, I'm not really interested, if you're going to try and develop your people, make it part of their job. To say to somebody on your team, we're really concerned about inflation. Can you spend a little bit of time researching and thinking about, if inflation is X or Y, how is that going to impact our customers? How have they behaved in the past? What are the things we need to look for? So I think one of the ways to drive this is by asking our people questions, because we don't have the answers and they're going to help us find them. So I think it's about asking some of those right questions, stretching people, helping people recognize, that might not be on your job description, but it's vital to the company. And it's going to be vital to your well-being at the company. So, some of those experiences, because you ask the question, you force people to think differently.